One good way of introducing the topic of social epistemology is by looking at an epistemology that is very much not social. And as with so many discussions in contemporary philosophy, a fantastic place to start are the Meditations of René Descartes. So when Descartes wants to get true knowledge, real knowledge, solid knowledge, right, the kind of knowledge that he is after, what does he do? Well, what does the meditator in the Meditations do? This sort of fictional character whom we are supposed to emulate, I think, whom we are supposed to sort of follow in his quest for real knowledge. Well, what he does is basically he locks himself up in a room and sits down and starts thinking. And among the first thoughts he has is that everything that has been taught to him by other people might be wrong. Right? If he wants to get really good knowledge, he has to clean his mind, start from zero, and build up his own knowledge step by step, relying only on his own insight into what is true, what has to be true, right? What he can be certain of. So this meditator of the Meditations of Descartes is in a sense an antisocial, or maybe we should say a non-social subject, right? Somebody who is not in a social situation. In fact, and that's why we might want to call him antisocial, it seems that the big problem is that other people might have taught him things that are wrong. Right? And so he needs to get out everything that other people have taught him, and he needs to get out those other people, right? They have to sort of leave his world. He needs to get into this little cocoon where he can think for himself and thereby arrive at the truth. Now, that is not the way, of course, that most epistemologists think about knowledge, right? We do not normally follow René Descartes in saying, okay, start by forgetting everything you've ever been taught. Right? We don't usually do that. But it is true that, like the classic epistemology of not only the 17th century, but all the way up to at least the late 20th century, and you can still see a lot of it today, that this classic epistemology doesn't really care so much, or sometimes at all, about our relationships to other people. Right? It's about me. It's about my thoughts. It's about, am I justified? Okay, what do my beliefs have to be like in order for me to be justified? And so on. And in a sense, there's nothing wrong with that. Right? I mean, it makes sense to have as one of the topics of investigation in epistemology, right, the subject and the ways the subject thinks sort of in isolation. But it doesn't make a lot of sense to stop there, right? To draw the boundaries of epistemology around the single subject. Because we are not, in fact, in a situation where we think and come to beliefs and arrive at justification alone without interaction with other people. So, for instance, one way that we clearly depend on other people is in testimony. Right? To remind you, this concept of testimony in epistemology is used fairly broadly. It's just about people telling you about things, right? And most of the stuff that you know, or at least most of the stuff that you know about sort of the wider world, is based on testimony, right? It's based on other people writing down or telling you or in some way recording what they have seen, heard, experienced, the conclusions that they have drawn, and so on and so forth. That's what our entire world picture really is based on. So, as soon as we start paying attention to things like that, to something like testimony, we are, in a sense, doing social epistemology. Right? We're no longer looking at the individual in isolation, we're looking at the individual as related to other individuals. So, one way to think about social epistemology is to think of it as that part of epistemology that looks at what we might call social epistemic dependence. So social epistemic dependence, it's dependence, right? We depend on something for our knowledge, that's the epistemic, and what we depend on for our knowledge is social, right? It has to do with other people. Okay. But really, social epistemology only comes into its own, you could say. It only becomes something really new if what we say about things like testimony takes on a particular form. So recall that when we talked about testimony, one of the theories of testimony that we discussed was a reductive theory of testimony. A theory that said, well, look, how can you get knowledge from what other people tell you? Well, in a sense, this is just a kind of sensory knowledge. And you can only accept what other people tell you if you have reasons to believe that it's probably true. And those reasons are, standard empirical reasons. Like maybe you have seen a lot of people tell you things, and you managed to check whether some of these things were true. And very often they turned out to be true. And so that's how you have come to know that when other people tell you something, it's usually true. Right? And if that's the story that we tell about testimony, then this testimonial evidence is really based on my own first-person empirical evidence. Right? I mean, things start with me knowing by observation that people usually tell the truth, and then when people tell me something, I can use that prior knowledge and apply it to what they tell me and come to a certain conclusion about it. But here the social is, whatever role it plays, it's based on my first-person insight that it's trustworthy, right? What people tell me, I can accept it because I have this first-person, not based on testimony insight, that testimony is usually reliable. If that's the final story, then the social, it's there, but it's not there at the fundamental level, right? It, in a sense, can be reduced away, or at least it can be fitted fairly neatly into an epistemology that has, at the fundamental level, no social aspects. So, social epistemology really comes into its own when we don't do that. Right? When we think that there is something fundamentally social about all knowledge maybe, or about certain kinds of knowledge, that we can't really understand our knowledge and the way that we are epistemic subjects except by describing us as part of a larger community. And so that would be sort of really social epistemology. And we could think of many ways that might happen. Here's a very, very fundamental way of trying to do that. One could say, and I'm not going to delve deeply into this, but one could say that knowledge requires language, and that language is inherently social, right? That the idea of a sort of single person talking a language, or even a single person being in control of a language, makes no sense, right? That would be a very fundamental argument, trying to prove bottom up that that whatever happens in epistemology has to have a fundamentally social aspect. Now, that's usually not the kind of stuff that social epistemologists are talking about. Social epistemologists tend to focus on more high-level phenomena, right? They tend to focus on things like testimony, right? And then if they claim that testimony is fundamental to getting knowledge, and you can't reduce it to some first-person empirical kind of knowledge, okay, then we're really pushing the social part, the social aspect of epistemology. So here's how John Greco, a well-known epistemologist, puts it. John Greco tells us that, we are really in the social part of epistemology when we do not just rely on other people, but when we vulnerably rely on other people. So what does it mean, this vulnerably? Well, it means that we are not in control, right? It's not the case that I have a good, from my own perspective, a good justification for believing that you are going to tell me the truth, and that's why I believe you, right? So that would be a situation where I depend on you, but I don't vulnerably depend on you, in the sense that I have my own reasons for believing you. I vulnerably depend on you, and if I don't have that, if I just have to trust you, right? If I'm vulnerably depending on other people for my knowledge, if in order to get that knowledge, in a sense, I just have to trust people. I just have to trust maybe a lot of people, or maybe a few people, or maybe I have to trust that most people will tell me the truth, or have done their epistemic best, or whatever it is that I'm trusting. But that's when I really turn out to be a fundamentally social being in epistemology, right? If I really need other people in the sense that I have to trust that they are going to help me out, that they are after truth, that they can be relied upon. That doesn't mean that I have to trust them unconditionally, right? I mean, you probably shouldn't trust anyone unconditionally, in the sense that there might arise some circumstances in which you're going to stop trusting them, right? I mean, you trust this person and then you find out that they lied to you on 27 occasions. Okay, that's a good point maybe at which to drop your trust. So trusting someone doesn't necessarily mean trusting them unconditionally, but in the context that we're talking about, it does mean just trusting them, right? Not having a reason to believe that they'll tell you the truth, sort of something that guarantees that, or at least makes it likely. Now, this idea that we vulnerably depend on other people actually fits the practice of science very well, right? So we might think of science as a place where people are very critical, or maybe they don't trust each other so much, but actually science couldn't work without people trusting each other all the time, right? When scientists write a report and they say, well, this is the research that I've done, this is the data that I've gotten, these are the results that I'm gonna sort of deduce from that, here's my conclusions. Well, usually other scientists won't just read it and think, oh, I trust the conclusion, although they might, especially if it's a well-known article, if it's been cited a lot of times, and if they themselves are from a different area of science, right? If they don't have the expertise to critically look at the article, they might just accept the conclusions, especially if this article has been embraced by the scientific community. So that happens. But even if you're in the same area, okay, maybe you're going to critically look at the conclusion that gets drawn. But usually you are going to trust that the scientists have actually done the research that they describe, and that they actually got the data that they say that they got, right? Science would get nowhere if scientists didn't trust each other at least enough to assume that the other person is telling the truth about what they've done and what they found. And again, that trust is not unconditional, right? Sometimes we find out that there has been fraud, but that's not the standard way of thinking, right? We don't look at other scientists thinking, they might be a fraudster. I can only believe what they say if I have some proof that they're not a fraudster. I mean, that's not how science works, and it's not how science could work. I mean, what are we going to do? Right, hang cameras 24/7 in every lab and watch the feeds of other scientists to check that they're not cheating. I mean, that wouldn't work, right? You would need somebody to 24/7 check on every scientist. So, that would be unworkable. Also, I would say very, very undesirable. So, the idea that humans are social beings that trust each other, and that this plays an essential role in how we get knowledge, makes a lot of sense. And that is, one could say, the idea that is underlying a lot of social epistemology. Okay, so what kind of topics are social epistemologists interested in? Well, we've actually already seen two of them, because we've talked about testimony, and I mentioned that a lot just now, and we also talked about peer disagreement, right? What happens when you find out that somebody who knows just as much about a topic as you, who's just as intelligent as you, has come to a different conclusion? I mean, what do we do, right? Okay, we need to talk to each other probably. Suppose that we still end up with a different conclusion. Should we both drop our confidence, or should we sort of keep believing what we already believe, or how should we deal with that? Well, that's a topic for social epistemology. We could also try to change some of the foundations of traditional epistemology a little bit more radically. So, for instance, one of the things that social epistemologists have been trying to think through is the idea that some knowledge might not be had by individuals, but by collectives, right? And that's a way that we sometimes talk, right? We say something like, well, science has found out that the Earth orbits the Sun. Okay, science has found out that the Earth orbits the Sun. So here the subject seems to be science. And maybe that's just a way of talking about some specific scientists without actually naming them. But on the other hand, maybe sometimes we really do want to talk about a community. Right? Maybe sometimes we really want to say, well, this community, let's say the community of epidemiologists, they know that this type of disease is transmitted in this and that way, right? That's something that we might want to say, right? That's a way that we certainly talk. It seems to make sense. And so we can wonder whether we can apply these epistemological terms like belief, for instance, or justification, whether we can apply them to groups, right? When does a group believe something, right? When do epidemiologists or the epidemiologist community, when do they believe something? Well, one way of thinking about that is what we could call summativism. So the group is the sum of the individuals. And the idea might be that a group believes something if all of its members believe it. Maybe. If you have a large group, that's going to be a bit hard. The group is not going to believe a lot of stuff. So maybe we would like to say something like, well, the group believes something if most of its members believe it. Or if the vast majority of its members believe it. Something like that. So that would be a way of trying to reduce, really, belief at the group level to belief at the individual level. And so that's, again, a kind of reductive move that allows you to talk about epistemology in social terms, but at the same time, it's not going to make it fundamental, right? I mean, the fundamental thing is still the individual. On the other hand, there's something, a position called collectivism, which is trying to make the group, in a sense, a little bit more of a substantial epistemic actor. And one way to try to do that, maybe, is to think about group commitments. Right? We could say something like, well, a group is committed to that or committed to do that, maybe. So let's say that these epidemiologists, as a group, it turns out that when disease A breaks out somewhere, that the epidemiological community, like the actions that they take, are going to be such that they push in all kinds of committees and government meetings and medical meetings and so on, they push for, let's say, giving people access to clean drinking water. Right? I mean, because they say that's going to stop the spread of the disease. If we bring them clean drinking water, if we clean up the water sources that they are already using, that's going to stop or halt or limit the spread of this disease. Right? If that's what happens, then it seems that they are committed as a group to the belief that this disease is spread through water, right? Through drinking water, through things that are in the drinking water. And so it seems that the group as a whole has a certain type of commitment, which implies a certain kind of belief, right? And so we might ascribe the belief to the group even without really delving into what the individual members believe. And if we try to push this a little bit further, I mean, we can maybe even imagine that there are beliefs that a group has that no individual members have. Maybe. Right? So suppose, for instance, that we are a group of people and we are in the jungle and we have certain commitments, right? And when it comes to health, diseases, you are going to rely on me, right? Because I know a lot about health and diseases. And when it comes to survival skills, you are going to trust Mary. I mean, Mary knows a lot about survival skills. Okay. And so here's something that I believe. Well, I believe that if we find ourselves struck by certain disease symptoms, then it's probably because of bacteria in the drinking water. And Mary believes that if you need to clean water, what you need to do is you need to cook it. I mean, that's something that she believes. That's something that she's done a lot, right? And so as a group, what's going to happen, because, we rely on me when it comes to health and we rely on Mary when it comes to survival skills. So if we see certain symptoms among us, let's say a white skin and a dry cough, then we're going to cook our drinking water. I mean, that's what we're going to do. But nobody actually believes that if we have these symptoms, then we ought to cook our drinking water. I mean, I believe that if we have these symptoms, then we ought to, mistrust our water. And Mary believes that if we mistrust our water, we ought to cook it. And so, as a group, we have a belief that none of us individually has, right? It's only because certain beliefs that we have connect in certain ways that we are committed to something. None of us has already made that connection. Okay, so maybe it's possible to claim things like that, right? To claim things like, groups can have beliefs that the individual members don't. Maybe that's useful. Okay, so those are some of the things that social epistemologists are interested in. But social epistemology also affords a very natural way of starting to think about topics that have to do with knowledge and other epistemic categories, but that are also have to do with, things that are happening in society and with ethical issues and with political issues. And so there is a very, I would say a very gradual change. That's not really the word I'm looking for. But there's a very gradual way in which through social epistemology also turns into ethics maybe, political philosophy certainly. So there's a bridge there, or there's a road there from epistemology to ethics, political philosophy and other normative disciplines, as well as to social sciences, such as sociology and psychology. And so, to mention just a few of the things that epistemologists are interested in, that social epistemologists are interested in, and which really go into that more ethical or political or sociological direction, is, for instance, people have been interested in the idea of information bubbles, right? The idea that there's something about the structure of our current society that makes it the case that some people, when it comes to certain topics, are isolated from sort of the general views of society and get information in a certain kind of bubble, right? They get a sort of limited and maybe self-reinforcing type of information. Closely connected to that would be an interest in things like misinformation and fake news, right? That's a hot topic, of course, and it's something that social epistemologists have been thinking about, have been interested in. Also, to go, I suppose, even more to the normative, ethico-political side of things, people have been thinking about things like epistemic injustice, right? What is it, like in the world of knowledge, for there to be injustices, right? Suppose that certain people aren't believed or are not believed as easily as other people, independently of how strong their justifications and their evidence is. I mean, that would be a kind of injustice that on the one hand has an ethico-political dimension, right? It's unfair, but it also has an epistemological dimension because it might actually undermine the goodness of our knowledge, right? If we have these kinds of social structures where not all evidence is taken equally because of, the way that we think maybe about certain people or the way that we allow certain people access to discussions. So that too is something that social epistemology has been extremely interested in. And we are going to meet many of these topics going forward. So this video, just an overview of what social epistemology more or less is. And in future videos, we are going to see a lot of these topics reappear.